Hello, welcome to this Lit in Colour Pioneers Author Q&A event with poet and novelist Benjamin Zephaniah. My name is Lynette Goddard and I'm currently a Professor of Black and Performance at Royal Holloway, University of London. I'm a historian, analysing Black British plays and thinking about their social and political and historical contexts. And I've been particularly interested in the ways in which plays reflect our real world issues and how we can use plays to understand those issues. So my most recent substantial work has been about 4 Black British playwrights, Bola Agbaji, Kwame Kwei-Armah, Debbie Tucker-Green and Roy Williams. And I look at a range of human rights and identity politics themes. I'm also the person who wrote the introduction to the Methuen student edition of Refugee Boy, which is why I've got the honour of introducing this Q&A today. So Lit in Colour is a campaign that the publisher Penguin Books runs in partnership with race equality think tank, the Runnymede Trust. Bloomsbury, the publisher of Refugee Boy, are partners of the Lit in Colour campaign. Lit in Colour is all about supporting schools to make the teaching of English more inclusive of writers of colour. Lit in Colour's Pioneers Pilot is supporting 100 schools who have changed their GCSE and or A-level to Pearson Edexcel's English literature specification, which enables students to study text by writers of colour. One of the chosen GCSE set texts is the play adaptation of Refugee Boy, written by award-winning author Benjamin Zephaniah and adapted for the stage by Lemn Sissay. So today we are pleased to have Benjamin with us to talk all about his novel. We're going to be talking about how he approached writing the novel, its main themes, the political and social context in which it's set, and what he wanted readers to take away from the way that he wrote the characters in Refugee Boy. We'll also talk a little bit about his reaction to Lemn Sissay's play adaptation of the novel and how he feels about his novel being adapted for the stage. So do remember that there's a Q&A after our conversation, so start to get your questions ready and add them to the chat box during the event. So welcome, Benjamin.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm awake, which is a really good start. And I got a drink, so I'm cool. Soya milk.
So I've got a range of questions that have actually been submitted prior to us meeting just now that have been asking about your writing and about the play. And so I'm just going to spend some time, maybe about 30 minutes, going through some of those questions. I've bunched them up to make sort of questions link and cohere with each other. So they've kind of informed the way that I've organised what I'm going to ask you today. So we'll just start off by talking a little bit about your writing background, how you started writing, and whether and how you're inspired by other artists. Quite a few people were really interested in how you got into writing, what prompted you to become a poet.
Well, it's interesting
novelist. I wonder if you could say
yeah, sorry. I always saw myself as a poet and a performance poet at that. So I grew up in a house. My mother was from Jamaica, my father from Barbados. They didn't have any books in the house, apart from kind of religious books. And but I always loved poetry. I loved words. I loved rhyme. I loved the way that people spoke with rhythm. And before I understood what the word poetry meant, I used to do a thing what I call playing with words, which somebody, adult, then went on to tell me was poetry. So the poetry that I encountered when I was young was poetry that my mother would recite. Jamaican poetry, kind of handed down from grandmother to mother, that kind of stuff. Poetry that they kind of spoke to each other, kind of sitting on the veranda. Stories about everything from, a recipe, you know, be careful of the dark, be careful of the ghost, political liberation or
Mm,
political struggle or something. So that was the poetry that I knew. So when I was doing poetry, I always thought about the audience. For me, it wasn't really about writing it down. So I started performing in Birmingham, where I lived, mainly in the black community.
mm,
I can actually remember a day when a man came to me and said, "I think white people would like to hear this too." And I was like, "Would
mm,
they?" All my poems about racism. And he was like, "Yeah, there are white people that are not racist." And I was
mm,
like, "What? Let me meet them." And I left Birmingham and went to London. And I was happily doing my poetry. And somebody again said to me, if I wanted to be a serious poet, I had to get published.
yeah.
So then I started trying to find publishers. But all I was doing was writing my performance poetry down. I wasn't thinking about it for the page. And a lot of the publishers just didn't get it. So I had an awful lot of rejections. And then I just said, forget that. I just carried on performing. And in the early 80s, I got such a following for my poetry that all the publishers came running back to me.
Mm,
So I always tell young writers now, if they do performance poetry, perform, be good at what you do, embarrass the publishers, let them come to you, you
mm,
know. And that's how it happened. And then I had a really good editor who used to work for Penguin Books or Poppy Books. Amazing woman, I think. She was editing my poetry when I was in Puffin, and she went to work for a publisher you may know of called Bloomsbury. And she said to Bloomsbury, "I'd like to publish Benjamin Zephaniah as a novelist."
right. Yeah.
And that's how my first novel was published, Face.
So, right. Yeah, that's right. That was your first. How far before Refugee Boy was that published?
Oh, don't ask me those questions. I can never remember time and numbers.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I was doing a talk not so long ago, and I was trying to remember the order of my books and when they was published,
Yeah.
and I got it all wrong. And somebody in the audience sat up and just told me exactly when I published all my books, the space in between them, and I was like shocked because I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sure. Well, I know Face was first. I think Refugee Boy was second.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't
So
remember the
that's
years.
kind of interesting. So someone says they want to publish you as a novelist. Did you have the novel? Had they seen Face, or did
No,
they just you hadn't written it yet?
oh, she
Right.
just used to listen to me talking and talk about my experiences and talk about my
Uh-huh.
ideas. And she said, you'd be a good novelist. And I was like, nah, I'm a poet. And it's quite funny actually um, I did my when I agreed to do the novel.
Mm,
Um, I then started to read lots of other novels for young adults, and then realized that I shouldn't really be doing this. Because I need to find my own voice. I was looking at them and thinking, how do they do it? So I can copy one of them. And I just thought, no, 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 no. I am very dyslexic,
right.
severely dyslexic. So when I was younger, reading was very difficult for me at school. And I remember what it was like when I was given a book at school. I didn't see the book, I didn't see the story. I looked at the size of the book and thought, this is hard work.
Yeah.
But I also knew that if you are reading a book and it's engaging, you forget about the size of it. You just get carried away with the story. And so when I'm writing books now, my novels, I imagine the 14, 15-year-old Benjamin Zephaniah and think, what would he like to have read?
Yeah.
And that's how I start. That's the research I do. I research
Oh, is it?
myself because I know I was a reluctant reader when I was young, although I loved words and I loved stories.
Can I just get you to think about Refugee Boy in particular now then, and sort of what particularly inspired you to write a novel about an Ethiopian and Eritrean asylum seeker? I know you've just mentioned that your research is kind of looking back into yourself, but is there any other research that you had to do in order to represent that experience? And what do you hope
Yes.
that young readers get out of that novel in particular?
Well, I had to do research for it, yes, because I've never been a refugee, but the research was
Yes.
relatively easy. I was
Okay.
living in the East End of London, surrounded by refugees.
Uh-huh.
And I used to, well, I still have a kind of very old-fashioned sports car. It's very old. It's very old, probably older than you. It's old, and you know, like many blokes on a Sunday, I take it out and I polish it and I make sure it's all running. And children like it. You know, it's just one of those cars that children like. And anyway, I used to see this boy watching me all the time. And a friend of mine who was a teacher at the local school said to me one day, he said, "Do you know this boy?" And I said, "No, but he's always watching me." And he said, "Oh, in school, this boy is not paying much attention. This boy, you know, he's not really with it. His mind seems to be somewhere else." And so one day I was working on my car and I called him over. I said, "Come here, man, help me do this." It was just a way of getting to talk to him. And so I got to know him a little bit, he told me his story. I won't go into detail, but he
No,
watched his father being shot. I beg your pardon, he watched his mother being shot first, and then his father, and then they put a gun to his head and said, "You're going to count to 10. And if you're still here, we're going to shoot you too." He ran into a bush, met these guerrilla fighters who said, we'll turn you into a fighter or we can send you to in exile. And he said, "I don't want to kill anybody." And he came in exile and he came to Britain as a refugee.
oh, right.
So I went back to my friend, the teacher, and I said, "This boy is not being naughty. This boy is actually traumatized. He was getting no help mentally. He was suffering from
Yeah,
post-traumatic stress, I guess."
yeah, yeah,
Yes. And then I listened to his story. And at the time, there was a lot of stuff in the news about refugees,
yeah,
but it was about adults and it was about statistics. And I just thought, well, I want to write about a young person and I want to really tell a human story. So I spoke to a few refugees, and there's two in particular who the book is dedicated to Ethiopian refugees. I could have written about many countries, but
yes,
I wanted to write, I didn't want to write about war. I almost wanted to write about the consequences of war.
yeah, yeah,
And what happened, I lived in Yugoslavia for a short while. And I have friends in Yugoslavia who were, you know, one was Croat and one was Serb, and they were married. And the war happened and they got divorced, you know, because they found they were on different sides of the war. And I thought, that's crazy. What about your children? You can't split your children in half, you know, and send one to Bosnia or one to Serbia or one to Croatia. Um, so I just picked Ethiopia because I knew Ethiopia a bit, and I knew about the war between Eritrea um, and Ethiopia. So, but it could have almost been anywhere.
yes.
So
That
that's how I
explains
came to
so
write the
much.
story.
Yeah, that explains a lot actually about that. Puts quite a lot into perspective for me, certainly in terms of thinking about that play and particularly the kind of richness with which it captures Alam's. It's particularly Alam's point of view as that we see in the novel and then in the play. Um, and the idea of a kind of a border dispute and the ways in which a border dispute affects someone as one parent from one side, another parent from the other side of the border, put in place. So there's quite a few themes in the novel that I find interesting. I just wonder whether we can get back some of those for a moment. Some of them are
I can
fear
remember
and
them.
violence. I'm going to tell you them. Don't worry, I'm going to remind you. One of them is fear and violence, which, as you're talking about the scene of the story that the young person told you, and the way that the novel opens with the soldiers,
Yes.
first of all in Ethiopia and then in Eritrea.
Yeah.
So the way that violence kind of is the first impact that we have of this story. There's also the way in which that then kind of evolves into kind of Alam arriving, finding himself in the hotel room and kind of thinking about, well, where is home? Because home is Eritrea and or Ethiopia, but now I'm in England. How do I make a home for myself in England? I wonder whether you can just talk about those themes first of all and what you were trying to work with in relation to those. So
Well, the way
violence,
the
fear.
novel starts, sorry, the way the novel starts, I did that because I wanted to show that I wasn't taking sides.
Yeah.
Violence is violence. That's it. Violence is violence. People should not be violent. It doesn't do any good, and nobody wins, especially when it comes to countries. All you can do is have peace for a while, but it's only for a while. If violence is the way you sort out your problems, it's not going to work. I find it quite astonishing that we know that in schools and places. We go to our children and say, you can't sort out your problem with violence. And we teach them that. And then politicians say, we can. I just find that outrageous. So I wanted to show the absurdity. Two situations at the beginning of the novel, and they're exactly the same, except for one's
Identical.
in Ethiopia and one's in
Yeah.
Eritrea. And
Yeah.
word for word, it's exactly the same. So I wanted to show that I'm not blaming, um, I'm not taking sides, rather. Right? War is evil. But it's the consequences of war. So Alam parents, one parent comes from one side of the war and another parent comes from the other side of the war, and they can't survive there. When Alam comes to England, he's a curious boy. He wants to learn. He's a thinking boy, and he's a really caring boy as well. He just finds himself in this situation where he's just really trying to find himself. He's trying to, he has this obsession with English literature, for example, because he wants to educate himself. I mean, when I come across, as I do all the time, because I come from one immigrant families, refugee families, there's an obsession with doing better, you know, with educating yourself and getting on, and you have to do it twice as hard as the natives because, you are going to be discriminated against and all that. And Alan's father as well wants to raise him as a good boy and to get him to do the right thing. So it's, how do you, I wanted to explore, with Alan, I wanted him to explore, or me to explore through him, how you negotiate yourself as a young boy who's come from a place of war, and like the boy watching me do in the car, I suddenly got to go to school. I suddenly got to be a normal English boy who's not really accepted as English, but has got to get on at school and make friends and do all the things that little boys want to do to fit in.
Mm.
So yeah, that I felt it was really important to have Alam as somebody who was a deep thinker. Although he was a boy, he was a deep thinker, and but wasn't involved in this situation, this war situation that got him here. He just wanted his mother and his father. And I hesitate now because I'm not sure. I don't want to give the end of the book away for people who haven't read it. But in one way, he wins in the end, but in one way, he loses in the end. I didn't want to tie it up a neat end, because I want to show that none of us can have it all. None of us can have it all. We may have small victories, but sometimes we have to have sacrifices for those victories.
Of course, yeah. I was really struck by Alan's sort of wanting to learn, because for me it was like so different to the ways in which we hear about young black boys, for example, that they don't want to learn, they don't want to do. So I was really struck by that, and also I guess the contrast between him and even Ruth, actually, in the play, who's kind of like, can you be bothered with all that literature? I can't be bothered with it, because she's had it her whole life, so she's kind of pushing it away, whereas he hasn't had it and he's eager to get more. But I just want to go back to the kind of asylum and immigration question, because you spoke just a moment ago about how, actually Alan's story is quite similar to, say, my parents from Barbados too, by the way, both of my parents from Barbados, just to say, but how, they pushed us to do better, get your education, learn, and so on. And I'm always struck by the ways in which there are parallels between the experience of, say, Windrush generation migrants and their children, and refugees and asylum seekers. So there are some people who say we shouldn't compare those experiences because, of course, the Windrush generation on some level, or economic migrants on some level, have a choice about whether to move, whereas someone, as the young boy that you've talked about, who's threatened with violence or being taken into war, doesn't have a choice about whether to move. And when I read Refugee Boy, I was really struck that you placed Alan with an Irish migrant family. And I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that, about how you see the experience of the asylum seeker compared with the migrants, and why you decided to place him with the Fitzgeralds. A few words, yeah.
I am of the belief, actually, I'm going to state a couple of facts.
Okay.
All the borders that we have are fake. They're all man-made. The idea of the nation state is quite a modern one in the scheme of things. Do you think when, I don't know, Jesus was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, do you think he needed a passport? I mean, we take these things for granted now, but they're all fake. If you look at most of the borders in Africa and Asia, in lots of parts of the world, well, let's just think about Africa and Asia. Most of those borders are drawn by the British and the French. Yeah. This island we call Britain, for years, whilst civilization was happening in other parts of the world, was uninhabited. Right? So technically, in my view, I should say, there's probably some historians listening to me now thinking, well, I'm not sure where he's going with this, but we're all refugees of one kind or another. We all came here from somewhere. All of us. I'm not talking about, black and Asian people and Bajan people and Jamaican people or Indian people. Even the white people came here. The Angles and the Saxons and all those tribes came here as settlers. They were fleeing sometimes persecution, sometimes they were fleeing earthquakes, sometimes they were fleeing, war. All of us. And you can say, okay, some people came here to work and get a better life for themselves. Well, You could say that possibly about some of the people on the boats coming now.
Yeah.
You know, why is it different when I've lived some of my life in Yugoslavia a little bit. I've lived in China. I mean, I've always kept my home here, but I've spent a lot of time in those places. I have never heard a British or a European person, for that matter, being called a migrant worker. They're called expats.
Yeah. Different language, right? Yeah.
Huh? Even when they're trying to live there, even sometimes when they have families there, they're still called expats.
Mm.
So, you know, I'm a humanitarian and I'm an internationalist, and I think that if we really care about each other, um, we can find a space for all of us. But I also understand that the reality is now is that there are these borders that people that have made. But I want to think beyond them. So when it comes to Windrush generation, refugees, refugees from Uganda, Idi Amin era, whatever.
Mhm.
When I just read a beautiful piece of Shakespeare. It's not in Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote it as for his friend, right? It sounds crazy. His friend was writing a book, and he came to a part in the book where wasn't sure how to write it, and so he said to his friend, who just happened to be William Shakespeare, "Can you write this part for me?" And it's the most moving piece of literature. Uh, and he's begging the people of Britain to be more compassionate to the poor refugees that are coming here. They're coming here on the boats. They're coming here but nothing but the shirts on their back. Who is he talking about? French Huguenots,
Oh, right.
you know? And it's like it could have been written today, apart from, the slightly archaic language.
Mm-mm.
So as long as we put borders up, and as long as we're going to have wars to defend those borders, we're going to have refugees and economic migrants,
Right, right. Yeah.
in my humble opinion.
No, that's cool. I've got a couple of questions. I think I'm going to go to one that's about, just because that's what you're talking about, but about the kind of relevance of the topic that you wrote about in 2000, 2001. The novel was published, and the kind of contemporary issues that we're facing, that we're seeing on our news every day at the moment. And also, there's been kind of waves. Like 2015, there was the so-called migrant crisis, for example, and our prime minister at that time, and also now these debates are back. So I'm going to read this question specifically as it's been written. So with the government's latest proposed bill regarding asylum seekers, the themes of Refugee Boy seem more relevant than ever. So there are two questions that are related to this. One is about how teachers can use Refugee Boy to make a difference. So would you, for example, recommend that this book, novel, and the play is studied with Ukrainian refugees, for example? And the other is about whether, if you were to rewrite the story now, whether you would change anything to reflect what's happened since your novel was published in 2001.
Well, I'll answer the last question first.
Yeah,
I
of course,
probably
yeah.
wouldn't change. I wouldn't change much. I mean, there's some things that probably. I mean, I think when I wrote it, I'm not sure if mobile phones were a big thing and social
Oh,
media
yeah.
was a big thing. you know, so there's stuff like that which would change. But the basic theme of the book and the way it's written, no, I wouldn't really change at all.
Mm,
Unfortunately, it's still relevant. Um, it's still very relevant. It's sad. I mean, it's really it's like when you think of something that you don't want to be true. I wrote this book to get people to empathize with refugees back in, was it the late 90s when I wrote it? I can't remember. Um,
yeah.
but I'll tell you something. I not recently I was kind of congratulated on this book and the amount it sold and etc. The show on radio where they only do like serious adult novels, and they actually did Refugee Boy once. Sorry, I forget the name of the program on Radio 4, but and I kind of felt a little bit sad because you want your books to sell, you want them to be out there, but actually you really don't want you want this problem to be gone.
Yeah.
But I'm pleased that teachers are using it to teach children about refugees. My greatest review, and like a lot of writers, we take reviews with a pinch of salt, was from an Ethiopian newspaper
Oh, right. Yeah.
that said at the end of it, they said they just don't understand how this son of Caribbean parents living in Britain got so underneath the skin of our East African problem. And I thought that was the greatest compliment. But actually, I remember, I think it was the first night the play was shown in Leeds, Yorkshire Playhouse. And I was there with Lemn. And after the show, we were sitting at these tables talking to these women. And it was really interesting because all these women had come together to watch the show. And they came from countries that were all at war with each other back, you know.
Wow.
So there was an Ethiopian sitting down with an Eritrean.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a Bosnian sitting with a Serb. There was, there was all these. There was a Sri Lankan, a Tamil with a Sinhalese woman. And we said, isn't this ironic, eh? I mean, our families are at war with each other back in our own countries, but we're here watching a play written by this guy that reflects our struggle, and we can do this in peace.
That's
It's really
interesting,
amazing.
isn't it? It speaks to the kind of questions around community and community support and the friendships, particularly in the play between the kind of young people and the way that they kind of come out in support of Alam,
Yes,
and
yeah.
in support of Alam's case. So, as you've raised I've got another question, but I'm going to try and run back round to that. As you've raised the adaptation, let's maybe talk a little bit about that now. You've already pointed to one of the things, which is about the importance of this novel being staged. And as you've said, many audiences can come to see it from different groups. So you've got your white audiences, you've got your Ethiopian, Eritrean, or you've got your wide range of audiences that can come to see this. But how did it come about that Lemn was actually adapting the play? I mean, were you invited to adapt the play and then you had to find someone to do it, or did Lemn approach you to adapt the play? How did that actually happen? Your version.
I was I was asked to write it, and I said no. I like sometimes when somebody fresh comes,
I see.
and it's just a thing of mine. I don't. I'm happy to adopt other people's work, but I don't really like adopting my own work. I had my vision, and so anyway, so I said no. Get another writer, and I said if you can, get a young writer, maybe their first play,
Okay, yeah.
And then I can't remember the name of the people, but they said, you're going to run it past Lemn Sissay. And I was like, well, go on then. It's probably going to be too busy. But I kind of didn't take it too seriously. I was convinced that it was going to be a young playwright. And then
Yeah.
Lemn called me, and I don't know what kind of conversations he was having with the other people, but he said, this is my story, and it is a little bit similar to his life story, not
Yeah,
exactly the
cool.
same, but some parallels. And
Yeah.
and I was just he's the person to write it.
Okay,
So I had a complete change of heart. Um, and I guess the next question is going to be, what do I think of his adaptation?
I think it's sort of that, yeah. And it's also because I saw an interview with you once. I think it was you and maybe Lemn on the same panel. It was a recorded interview, and you spoke about Lemn Sissay, because he's also a poet, bringing some of the poetry back into the novel.
Exactly.
That when you wrote the novel, you were like, I'm a novelist and I'm going to be serious, and this is, and all the poetry,
Yes.
a lot of the poetry that's in your poetry was taken out.
Yeah.
So yeah, what did you think of the adaptations? You saw the Leeds Playhouse, or West Yorkshire Playhouse as was then,
Yeah.
and have you seen any other productions of it?
Well, and also I oversaw the script writing as well.
Oh, you did, yeah.
But it wasn't as if I didn't, I had nothing to do with writing the script. I mean, I didn't write it, but I approved and I gave him feedback. And I really don't have much to say apart from what you just said. Really, when I was writing, when I'm writing a novel, I tend not to put any poetry in it. I'll put a poem at the back of the book,
Yeah.
but the writing itself is very much, he went from A to B and very factual, and I will literally measure distances, and if you take Refugee Boy and went to East London where it's set, you could walk the street and see that very accurate. When he turns the corner and he walks down the street, it's really accurate. I learned when I did my first novel, which I did the same thing with, because it was the first translation was in Japanese. Refugee Boy was translated in Japanese as well, and then immediately you get Japanese tourists walking around with a book, going, looking to see that everything is correct.
Yeah, like a map.
Yeah. But what Lem did really beautifully is he put poetry back into it. I dismiss any poetic thoughts and just tell the story, and Lem puts the poetry back into it, and I think that's the big difference. And yeah, he managed to capture the emotion, capture everything that I wanted to say politically, but just add poetry to it.
Yeah. Deportation, no way, the Kellos must stay. That's the line that I remember. When I saw the production at the Chicken Shed Theatre, which was 2017, I think, roughly, partly in research to write this edition, or to write a chapter on the play, they handed us, as audience members, they handed us leaflets as though we were part of the campaign. They placed leaflets on the seats and they handed them to us, and it really kind of implicated us as being, you can do something to help these campaigns. You don't just have to watch this play passively.
One of the things that I was just going to say very quickly, one of the things that schools do, which I think is absolutely amazing with this book, is that they literally will organise a demonstration and a march. And they'll send me photographs. They've literally done banners and they've done a demonstration down the street, and people will stop them and go, who's Alan? And they will say it as if it's a real person. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I find that really inspiring, and it's a way of. It's not so much just about my story. I think it's about telling children that if you feel really strongly about something, get together with people who feel strongly and try and make a stand.
I think that's one of the real takeaways from this, is just the way that those young people become activists in service of the story. I did have another question really quickly around kind of the adaptation.
I'll try.
Yeah, obviously there are some things that have to change for practical reasons when you're moving, because in your novel you can imagine whatever and people can imagine that in their minds. But in the play, obviously, you're limited by the size of the theatre, the amount of money that they've got for casting and so on. And one of the things that I found interesting in both productions is the ways in which they doubled some of the roles. So Ruth, for example, also played adjudicator. The actor who played Mr. Kello also played the hooded character. I wonder whether you've got any particular idea around good role in case students are doing your play with limited cast.
I'm really sorry. You kind of froze a little bit. So can you just say the question bit again? I got the build up to it, but
yeah. So when you do a play with limited cast, you have to double role, and I just wonder whether you've got any thoughts on the appropriateness of certain roles being doubled compared to to other roles, basically, in the play?
No, I've got no problem with it at all. They were. I don't know if you know. Do you know the play Was It Albert and this type of theatre that came out of
I've
South
heard of it,
Africa?
yeah. And
Oh, I
I
mean,
think
it's fantastic.
I've seen it. I
So
do
it's the
know it,
kind of
yeah.
it's theatre that kind of developed. Sorry, I can't remember the writers, but
Um,
in apartheid South Africa,
yeah,
and when white and black actors couldn't mix and all that kind of stuff,
yeah,
so you'd get kind of just two characters playing lots of characters,
right,
you
yeah.
know. And if they wanted to play a white person, they just put a nose on and go hello, you know, or whatever it is. You know, if they wanted to play, an East African, they would do so. And so I really love that type of theatre. I think you can do that with theatre. The theatre gives you that freedom to do it. So I have no problem with it. I think that the point is that I very rarely, when it's done, I can't think of a time. I'm not talking about my play or our play. When people have complained about that, unless it's done really badly.
Yeah, yeah.
Theatre, theatres, do, actors do it all the time. I'm sometimes
Okay.
I mean, sometimes I'm blown away by how good some actors are when they go from one character to another, and I go, "Is that the
Yeah,
same person?" I'm telling you, I go, "Is that the same person?"
yeah,
But no, it has to be done because, like you said, it's a stage play and they're limited.
yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm going to go to a couple of questions from the chat so that we have some of those, and
Oh, how I wish I could see them.
them up. And then I might go back to a couple more of mine as well. So I think there's one here that's come up quite a lot from the pre-questions as well, which is about other poems, books, or literatures that you could recommend schools focus on. So it says, apart from Refugee Boy, are there any poems or books, literature, or ideas that you would recommend that schools could focus on when they want to kind of explore these themes, I suppose?
Um, well, I mean, one of my favourites is, and shame on me because I can't remember the name of the writer. I can remember the name of the book, but this is actually for smaller children. It's
Okay.
called A Silence Seeker. It's about a
Ah, okay.
boy. He's told that his friend is an asylum seeker, and he hears it wrong. He thinks he's a silence seeker. Um, but I think it's a wonderful book. But it is for smaller children. Um, what else? Oh, my mind's frozen. That's the first
Yeah.
thing that comes to mind. Um, yeah, sorry, I can't think of any more.
Yeah. I'm thinking of a play. I don't know if you ever saw this play, but I don't know what the age group is. Maybe it's called Nine Lives by Zodwa Neone, and it's
No,
about
never.
a asylum seeker from Zimbabwe. It's a one-person play. I think it could work for young audiences
Yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Actually, it's crazy that I should forget that there's a. But I mean, this is open to the public, but it's only a play, and it's just like two
Mm.
nights on the 30th of March, and I think the next day, I can't remember if that's the 1st of April or whatever. But
Oh, April.
sorry, April, I beg your pardon. But yeah, 30th of March is coming.
30th of March is gone. We're the 16th now. Or 17th.
The 30th of March. Are you hearing me okay?
I'm hearing 13th. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right, yeah, yeah. So at my university, Brunel University, there's a play on, and I'm in it, but it's a film version of, and it's called The Price of Water,
Oh,
and it's
nice.
about refugees now. And there's a film, me doing a poem as part of the play. Anyway,
So the
but like I
30th and
said, that's on.
31st of March.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah. The
so
30th and the 31st, I think.
March. So
So sorry, I
what's
can't
your
think of any
favourite
book.
poem, Benjamin? Do you have a
What's
favourite
my
poem?
favorite poem?
Yeah. Do you have a favourite?
You
Someone's
mean
asked. Yeah, what's your favourite poem? Do you have a favourite poem of your own?
Of
Or do
my
you have
own?
a poem by anyone else? We can ask both.
Well, there's poems that I love performing and really long, rappy ones.
Mm,
But sometimes I like poems that are small and say a lot. So I'm going to tell you one of my favorite poems of all time. And I
okay.
try to write a poem like that. And it's very short. It's by Adrian Mitchell. And there's different versions of this, but this one is only 3 lines. 1, 2, 3. And the second line is only 1 word. Most people ignore most poetry because most poetry ignores most people. Adrian Mitchell, brilliant. And I think that says a lot about poetry. Now, I wanted to write my version of that, and I wrote one which is 4 lines, sorry. And on the surface, it may seem simple or even simplistic, but I think when you dig down, it's about stereotypes and what we think of women and what we think of men and what we think of poets. It's called Who's Who. I used to think nurses were women. I used to think police were men. I used to think poets were boring until I became one of them.
Thank you. That's lovely. People got a bit of performance poetry into the mix. That's really good. Um, just on that, actually, while we're still thinking about kind of poets and poetry, and you sort of answered some of this a little bit, but one of the pre-questions that came in was about what you think do you think poets, writers, artists, musicians need to be more vocal in terms of engaging with contemporary debates around, say, asylum or refugees, particularly in relation to the ways in which the media and our
Yes.
politicians present quite problematic views? Yeah, what
Yeah.
do you
But
think poets?
I come from a tradition where you use your music and your poetry to make a change.
Yeah,
You know, um, the music that I used to listen to as a child is the music that educated me, reggae music. Listening to people like Bob Marley, Burning Spear, Judy Mowat, Fabian Miranda. Um, they 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 were teaching us Black history when we couldn't get it at school, in music. They were teaching us spirituality and stuff like this when we couldn't get it at church. So music was important in my personal development. But I do think for people that don't have a voice, it can be used as a voice. I have the pleasure of having known Nelson Mandela. And he said to me, if anybody ever asks you if music and poetry can change anything, he said, send them to him. I'll never get it. I can't do his accent, but he said, send them to me, Benjamin, send them to me. Because he knows how important music and poetry was to the struggle for liberation in South Africa. So yeah, they're very important. I get a little bit depressed sometimes when I see bands thinking that they've arrived when they've made it on the BBC. You know, I mean, I think bands, poetry, and music, generally speaking, should be rebellious. It should be asking questions. It should be speaking truth to power. It shouldn't be just wanting to be on top of the pops. I mean, we don't have top of the pops now. You know what I mean? But it shouldn't just be wanting that kind of adulation. It should. And I mean, there are some musicians and some bands and some poets that recognise that too. So
it
there's a
sounds
space for
like to
pop.
me, because I always think that our theatre, the theatre that I like the most, that I think is the best theatre, is the theatre that does something in the world, that does something more than just the experience of going to see a play and enjoying a theatre. So a play like Refugee Boy, for example, for me, or Nine Lives, or those by Roy Williams and other writers that are really responding to current day issues. That's the best theatre for me. It's theatre that's
Yeah,
making a statement theatre, political theatre, rather than
yeah.
couple of nights ago, I went to see, no diss on it, but I went to see Medea. It was great. It was a great performance, but that's all it was. And then you watch it, you enjoy it, and you go home. But theatre that actually leaves me thinking years later about the plight of refugees or the plight of young black boys, whatever it might be, that's the theatre that really touches me. Someone's asking how long it took you to write your novel and which character in Refugee Boy you feel the most close to. You said you were writing it in the 90s. It was published in 2001. So I just wonder.
Oh, 2001. Well, I think it took me about 18 months to write it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm not the kind of writer that just writes and does nothing. At the same time, I'm doing concerts with my band. I'm doing this, that, and the other.
Of course.
About 18 months. As for characters, that's so difficult. I do like Ruth.
Yeah.
I did change her. Originally, in the very early draft, they were just really good friends that got on really well with each other.
Straight away,
And
yeah.
then I thought, no, I must create a bit of tension between them. You know, if in reality, a girl having a strange boy come into her house is going to feel a little bit, you know, a little bit of anxious, whatever. You know, it's going to be a little bit of an invasion. So, but you know, I like all my characters.
It was almost like
Even
sibling rivalry between her and
yes,
almost like kind of brother and sister being rivals with
yeah,
each other.
that's exactly what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But it's, you know,
And they love each other really, and they all get on,
yes,
but they've got that little edge. So
mm,
I think that's quite interesting in terms of a couple of the characters as well, because there's also Sweeney, who starts off the novel kind of as the bully, but then comes
yeah,
around to Alan with the campaign. So I don't know if you want to say anything about the ways in which those, you know, there's the friend, is it Mustafa that is his friend, which is the one who's watching the cars because his father drove off in a car. So I don't know if that relates to
mm,
the boy story that you originated some of this from. But the characters shift. You know, a lot of them are a little
yes.
bit semi hostile towards Alan, but then shift. And I wonder whether there's any message in that.
Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I mean, most people know this about a novel that when you have a character, this especially applies to the main character. You want to know that when you get to the end of the novel, they've had some life-changing event, or they've overcome some hurdle, they've overcome some adversity or something. But I think that can also be true of some of the, for want of a better word, the minor characters too. You know, I think we all judge each other. We try not to, even those of us that try not to, still judge each other by the way we look and etc. or our backgrounds and whatever, you know. And there's so many things, so many little. I was going to say minor prejudices. I'm not sure if that's a correct thing to say, but there's little things we have inside us that will make us. I mean, I met a friend of mine who we are very close friends now. But I remember when I first met him, I looked at him and I went, "He's like a racist fog." He just had that look about him, you know, tattooed and everything else. I got to know him. He was a gentle giant. You know, I mean, he was really nice, and I had to change my attitude to him. You know, and that was me judging the book by the cover or whatever you want to call it. You know. So yeah, with Sweeney and other characters, to I like them to change as well as the main character. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting because it talks about again the way in which the novel and the play kind of fosters greater understanding of each other, or kind of encourage us to understand each
Yes.
other better. And I want to kind of double back a bit before doing a couple more questions from the chat around the play novels focus on the bureaucratic processes of asylum. See Alan having to jump through all of these hoops, go to hearing. His story is not first of all, believed. He has to then try and convince people that him from asylum is true. We see him dealing with the care system, with the Home Office, etc. Was that one of the aims for you also, was to
Yes.
ensure that people understood just how difficult
Yes.
that asylum system is, and that
Yeah.
counters the media view? Yeah, a few words.
Some people just think refugees come here
Do you know what I
and
mean?
they get a council house, and they don't understand all the hoops they have to go through, all the forms and and sometimes forms in a language that they're not that familiar with, and sometimes they have to relive trauma. What did you see? Why did you come here? And all that kind of thing, and most of that I did just from my experiences and just generally knowing the care system. I was in care once for a short time too. Um, but I have to say, I mean, a lot of novelists, I mean, I alluded to this before, saying that when I write a novel, I start with me. What would I like to have read? A lot of novelists start to do a lot of research at the front. I don't. I write the story, and then if I need to do any research, I'll do it. So when I wrote Refugee Boy, I then gave it to lawyers who specialize in refugee stories, or refugee cases, I beg your pardon. And there's one bit of feedback they gave to me, and that was when Alam is fingerprinted, and because I didn't have that in there, they said, no, they have to get him on the computers, and it's almost next to the criminal computer, the database, fingerprint and photographed and processed in that. And so I went back and I wrote that little bit in after the feedback from the legal people. But one of my favorite parts of the book, actually, and I can't remember it word for word, is like when Alam's in court and he wishes I think he wishes the judge Merry Christmas. And the judge says it's not Christmas, but it's Ethiopian Christmas. Because it's I love that bit because, again, I can't remember if I allude to this in the book, but Ethiopia still has 13 months in its year.
Right.
Yeah, and its Christmas is like a lot of Orthodox, actually. Even Ukrainian Christmas, actually, is a slightly different time from ours. So I love playing with those things. Um, you know, whose civilization is this? You had your Christmas, now we're going to have ours. And Merry Christmas, Judge.
Cool. I'm aware of time, so I want to just squash in. So someone's asked a question twice, so I must ask that question, and then I've got a couple more.
Okay, I'm going to try and be quick.
Archie has asked twice, who is your greatest inspiration? And they say, you are mine. So who is your greatest inspiration?
You are mine. So, gosh.
That's what Archie says. So what
thank
do you say?
Archie. It's nice to be an inspiration. I'm just a bloke, a poet from Birmingham, trying to do my best. But if I can inspire you, that's a great thing. I'm inspired by everyday people. If I tell you who the people are that really inspire me, they're completely unknown. They are the cleaners. They are the road sweepers. They are women in Northern Ireland who have community centres bringing Catholics and Protestants together. There are women in South Africa who bring in white and black people together. In terms of literature, I'm really lucky to have met some of my heroes. Maya Angelou was a good friend of mine. Toni Morrison. I mentioned Nelson Mandela. I mean, I can't believe I know these people. So I've been really privileged to kind of get to know my heroes. The hero that I would really like to meet, and I'm not sure how many people in this forum will know this person, but it would be Angela Davis. Because when I was a young, she was like this black freedom fighter with a big afro and black power, and I just really admire her.
Thank you. One last quick question. It's just
Go on,
about
quick.
your thoughts on the Lit in Colour campaign, the importance of diversity in English literature. Do you have any recommendations also about how students who struggle with reading, how they can enjoy literature in alternative ways?
Well, I mean, I can see the clock going down. I'll just say very quickly, if you struggle with literature, find stuff that interests you. Even if it's football, there's literature on football. You know, whatever it is, cars, there's literature on cars. And for those dyslexic kids, dyslexia is not a mark of your intelligence.
Thank you so much, Benjamin, for your time, and wish all the students and teachers luck and enjoyment studying this novel, this play, and the adaptation. Enjoy Refugee Boy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.